Hi, welcome to FAR's Autumn Roundup virtual series. This presentation will be on nitrogen management in autumn sown barley. I'm Jo Drummond, the Senior Researcher for Cereals here at FAR, and I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues Jacqueline Strathoff and Emmanuel Chukwuzera for this work. Back in 2013, FAR released some cropping strategies on nitrogen application in wheat and barley. Now, those strategies covered autumn sown, irrigated feed and milling wheat, and spring sown barley. While this presentation is on autumn barley, I thought it might be useful to go back and see where we were in terms of our total optimum Ns and see how we've changed over time. Now, this work was based on trials that took place prior to 2013, so that decade probably between about 2000 and 2013. Our irrigated trials across that time period had yields of 6 to 7 tonnes per hectare. There were some that were up around the 9 tonne per hectare mark. And our dryland spring barley trials achieved around 5 to 6 tonnes per hectare. The amount of nitrogen per tonne of grain in the irrigated trials was 23 kilos per tonne of grain, and 26 kilos of nitrogen per tonne of grain was required for the dryland trials. Now, those trials had an average mineral N of around 82 kilos a hectare, but the range was between 28 and 155, and that depended a lot on what rotation position it was in. In this series of trials, the optimum nitrogen total, so from soil and applied sources, was around 188 kilos a hectare for irrigated, and the total optimum N in that dryland environment was 160 kilos per hectare. Since that time, we've understood a lot more about our soil supply. So nitrogen from our soil, we know our mineral N, so that's ready for uptake right now. I like to think of that as, when you're hungry, you can go to the fridge and the food is immediately ready for you to have. That's the same as our mineral N. It's ready right now. Our potentially mineralizable N, it's not ready yet, but it will become available over the season. And that's a little bit like the food that's in the freezer. You are hungry, you go to the freezer, you have to defrost it. It will be ready eventually, and you will be able to eat it. Potentially mineralizable N is just like that. So we're much better at understanding the different mineral N and potentially mineralizable N that come available over the season and that are ready right now. And that's helped us develop resources like having the nitrogen, having the confidence to cut back. So stay tuned for our spring field walks where we'll talk about these in the season when you're making the decision. We still lack the specific cropping strategies, particularly for autumn sown barley. So those original strategies I talked about from 2013, there were no autumn sown barley strategies. So this piece of work is looking at developing strategies for autumn sown crops. We ran this trial over both irrigated and dryland environments. So this is dryland yield. It achieved yields in the region of 9 tonnes per hectare. So if we think back, 5 to 6 for spring barley dryland, this was a really, really strong season. For us, the total N, the optimum total N in that season sat somewhere between 100 and 200 kilos per hectare. So from soil and from our applied sources. After about 200 to 250, we start to see diminishing returns on that investment. When we ran this through a model, bearing in mind we knew that our optimum was going to be somewhere between 100 and 200 kilos of N per hectare, the total biological optimum in this dryland autumn barley was, from all sources, 258 kilos of nitrogen per hectare from both soil and from applied sources. So this is the amount of nitrogen that to apply to get the absolute highest biological yield that you can achieve. This is not a target because this is not the application rate that's going to make you the most money. The application rate that's going to make you the most money is 124 kilos a hectare. So the difference between that total biological optimum and our economic optimum is 34 kilos of N per hectare. With a urea price of $1.93, that's a cost saving of around $66 a hectare. And when we consider that the LSD, so the difference between something that's significant and not, is around half a ton, a difference of 50 kilos, and that's the difference we're talking about between a biological optimum and an economic optimum, is not going to be significant. And interestingly, you can actually drop your nitrogen a really long way before it starts to impact your yield significantly. So that can give us some confidence that dropping back to our economic optimum is not going to negatively impact us in terms of production. So our total biological optimum was around 158 kilos of N per hectare. That worked out to around 17 kilos of nitrogen per tonne of grain, which is a pretty big difference to those original numbers we talked about in those earlier slides. When we factor in the economic optimum, that drops down to 124 kilos of N per hectare. In an irrigated environment, and I must preface this by saying that this trial achieved absolutely humongous yields. Our top yielders were up around the 14.5 tonnes per hectare. In our irrigated environment, that sweet spot, that optimum sweet spot, sat between 200 and 300 kilos of N per hectare from both soil and applied. And what that looked like in terms of a total biological optimum was around 245 kilos of N per hectare. There's a little bit of working out with the maths we need to do in this, given that the yields were so high. So come back to us in the springtime and this will all be worked through. But the difference between our total biological optimum and our total economic optimum was around 25 kilos. And again, at $1.93 for a kilo of N, if you're applying as urea, that's a cost saving of around $48 a hectare. Once again, you've got a really small difference between our biological and our economic optimum, so around 60 kilos. Again, our LSD is around 300 kilos. We're not seeing a significant yield drop if we drop back to that economic optimum. So this is really important, again, if we're in a highly productive environment, because it's easy to overspend, and overspend places it at risk of loss, nitrogen loss through volatilization or runoff and erosion or leaching. So if we're able to dial it back a little bit, it's not going to hurt us in terms of our productivity, and it's going to improve our profitability in our system. So just to recap, our total biological optimum requirement in that enormous barley crop was 245 kilos of N per hectare. That worked around 17 kilos of nitrogen per tonne of grain. And our total economic optimum was around 220 kilos of N per hectare. Pulling it all together, applying that economic rather than the biological optimum requirement does actually save you money without negatively impacting upon your yield, and it also has implications for your greenhouse gas emission numbers. The point here is that we need to confirm the curve. Actually, that curve is the same across all of our cereals, so we have some confidence that actually we do have quite a long way to go before we see significant yield drop. This piece of work is actually part of a regional program that includes plant growth regulator work, it includes fungicides, it includes cultivars and barley yellow dwarf virus management. Those trials are run across different parts of the country, so stay tuned for more results as we come into the spring. Thanks for listening.